Welcome to Why I Left, a podcast that explores the Great Resignation. I'm your host, Brian Akar. Join me as I chronicle real stories from real people about the reasons they decided to leave their jobs during the pandemic and what has happened since. Hello, and thanks for tuning in to this episode of Why I Left. In today's episode, I chat with Dr. Chrissy Lee. Dr. Lee is a distinguished speaker and published author in peer-reviewed journals centering research on gender and race-specific disparities in access to behavioral health impacting outcomes and neuropsychological assessment. Now, she is dedicated to the mission to create social and mentorship opportunities for underrepresented students and professionals, the promotion of culturally inclusive supervision and clinical practices, and providing education related to decolonizing practices within psychology. Let's go check it out. All right, welcome back. So our guest today is Dr. Chrissy Lee. Dr. Lee is a neuropsychologist whose research centers on gender and racial mental health care disparities and neuropsychological assessment. As one of the few bilingual neuropsychologists nationally, Dr. Lee provides a well-needed service of cognitive evaluation for Korean-speaking adults with memory concerns, in addition to providing evaluations across the lifespan in English. Now, as we kick off this BIPOC Mental Health Awareness Month, I wanted to bring her perspective as a licensed practitioner to the show to discuss not only the trends she's seeing in her practice, but also the community that she serves. So hi, Dr. Lee. How you doing today?
I'm doing well. I'm very excited for this opportunity.
Absolutely. And so now before we get into some of your work, tell us a little bit about your background and upbringing.
Well, I am a proud second generation Korean American, born of immigrants. I was born in South Philly, moved to New York very early on, about 4 years old, and raised in Queens. I come from a working class background. My family is a small business owner, and so I've worked in retail most of my life before going on to earn my degrees. So it's just a little bit about me.
Oh, very, very nice. And now talk to us a little bit about your work journey and what's worked well in some of the environments that you've been a part of.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's been quite a journey. Some parts that were more rougher and more difficult than others. As somebody who comes from a family where I'm the first in my family to graduate from college and to really enter kind of a corporate workforce. So I didn't really have a lot of information going in on what to expect or how to even act or what to wear a lot of times. And so what has worked for me has been the help of incredible mentors who kept it real and told me, all the little insider secrets that maybe I didn't grow up knowing.
Yeah. And now what are some of the things that you've been passionate about professionally?
Professionally, wow, where do I start? Well, I think recently I've been really moved personally and professionally about the growing awareness of the intersectionality of neurodiversity and other marginalized identities. I've been extremely passionate about raising awareness in the communities that I serve and even in the AAPI community about neurodiversity and how this may express in different ways for people of color.
And, one of the things I found interesting is so this background as a neuropsychologist, right? So when did you first know that this is what you wanted to become?
It's going to sound a little embarrassing, but probably a lot later than a lot of my peers. I went to school thinking that I wanted to do counseling, which I still do. Neuropsychology is not a word that I even knew of until my second year of graduate school when, on a whim, I took a class and really enjoyed it. In undergrad, I studied neuroscience, and so it was a logical leap to then study the brain and how it affects behavior. And I just found myself really fascinated with how much we know about the brain and also how little. So in a way, in terms of careers, I know that I'll always have a job because we're still learning about what the brain does. And so I look forward to kind of seeing where the research takes us.
And so for those who may not be familiar with the field and the practice, so what does a neuropsychologist do?
So a neuropsychologist, by training, their degree is in clinical psychology with additional specialization and training in neuropsychology. So everybody has that base of being a clinical psychologist. The additional training is to learn about the unique kind of functional neuroanatomy, emotions. Even though we like to think that they come from the heart, they're actually from, they originate from the brain. How we respond to the environment, how we respond to our own internal thoughts and feelings. This is all guided by the relationship between the brain and your environment. So a neuropsychologist, most of us, what we usually do are assessments, and that is to identify individual strengths and weaknesses in terms of cognitive profiles. Everybody has strengths and weaknesses. Depending on what that profile looks like, it can allow us to figure out what diagnoses may be most appropriate. And then I think, at least for me, the more important part is the treatment recommendations on, okay, so now you have a diagnosis, what next? How do we come at it from a strengths-based approach to utilize your strengths to help you in your recovery?
Great. And now, one of the things I'd like to do with the show is really kind of take folks back to when COVID started, right? And so March of 2020, the pandemic really gets kicked off. Talk to us a little bit about how the pandemic affected you and it really affected your work.
Yeah, I can't believe that it's already been 3 years. I'm starting to forget what life was like pre-pandemic. But for me, I was in my last few months of postdoctoral training. The hospital I was working at, we had to shut down. I was literally in the middle of an assessment with somebody when we got the notice that we had to stop and go home. So for a long time, we didn't really know as a field, what we were going to do without being able to do evaluations in person. And so in a way, it was nice to kind of see the field meet the cultural moment and very quickly figure out alternative methods of being able to still do these assessments. And so I was kind of happy with how flexible I could be in adapting to the telehealth modality. And then I think a few months later, I then had to pause after going into helping mode of, okay, how do we get, help to our patients despite the barriers that are there? And then I had to take a step back to kind of also think about myself in this big milestone. I'm graduating from fellowship, starting my first job. I think in a way, it was a little bit bittersweet. I was happy to meet those milestones, but it was also sad to have those milestones without the, graduation ceremony and all these things that come along with it. So there were, moments of happiness and then also, moments of sadness as well, just like I think most people.
Yeah, no, definitely. And, I feel for those folks who graduated at that time and who didn't get that experience, right? Whether it's high school, college, grad school, all the things. So when you think about the pandemic, right, what were some of the things that you started to learn during this time, either with yourself or really with your clients?
Yeah, well, I think I learned just how important that connection was to other people. It also helped me broaden my idea of what connection is. Of course, there's nothing that can beat that in-person, warm connection that you can have with somebody. But what I found was that even with telehealth, people were really responding well to it. And in fact, it increased our reach in terms of accessing folks who may have had issues with transportation, getting to the hospital, folks who may have been, suffering with anxiety about leaving the house or just struggling to get to the appointments for whatever reason. So it did open up a lot of access. And so that's been nice to see. It still remains. Telehealth is still a booming industry and a lot of folks are really responding positively to it.
No, that's great. And so what are like 3 ways in which you've noticed the pandemic's impact on mental health as a whole, whether within the communities you serve or just nationally, taking a look at some of the trends you're noticing?
So I think just like with most things, the pandemic brought to light anything that was already kind of tenuous and vulnerable. So, if you were an individual who maybe had a predisposition to anxiety or depression, it became even more magnified. We know that social isolation is one of the main kind of triggers for a depressive episode, or things like that of that nature. Unfortunately, for some folks, they may have experienced kind of setbacks in their recovery. They experienced some loss in their lives that also could be triggers as well. But there were not, so those are some of the negative things that I noticed, but there were also some interestingly positive effects that I noticed as well. For folks, and this is just true for, what I noticed in terms of the patients that were under my care, but for some folks who may have struggled with anxiety relating to like OCD, contamination fears, fear of germs, illness, individuals who may have had social anxiety, I noticed kind of an opposite trend where I had patients saying, I've been training for this my whole life. I feel extra prepared for this moment. And they tended to excel in this situation, which was, not something that I had predicted. Another thing that I noticed with the younger folks that I was seeing, typically when a teenager is coming to me, it's because they're having difficulty at school, either because of undiagnosed neurodiversity or, new onset of being bullied and anxiety and depression or changes in the home that could be impacting them. For some of these kids who were historically on the fringe, those who are neurodiverse, they kind of excelled during this time of staying home and attending school remotely because they didn't have that extra layer of being bullied at school or worrying about how they were being perceived by others.
Very nice. And, it's interesting that I haven't thought about it in that way, right? Some of the folks you mentioned who may have OCD, like this being their time to shine, if you will. I have not thought about it that way. So I appreciate you kind of putting that in, planting that seed for me. When you mentioned that you finished your fellowship, during this time. And so what was that like? Cause it sounded like it was like you said, a little bittersweet, but like you finished this fellowship, huge accomplishment, world's kind of crumbling on the outside. So how did you kind of balance these two feelings while you were living through this time?
I don't know if balance is the right word. I don't know if I was able to balance it. I think 3 years later, I'm only now coming to terms about, really grieving that loss, honestly. At the time, I was on go, go, go mode. I was like, okay, I'm graduating. I need to get a job. I need to make sure that I'm doing well on this first job. I'm also trying to deal with, all the challenges of transitioning to telehealth and being creative and imaginative about how to do my assessments over the computer and what was ethical, what was not ethical. I mean, the field was the listservs were very busy about people arguing on if we should be testing or if we shouldn't be testing. I think they're still ongoing. So I don't know if I had a chance to really stop and reflect inward. Only now, in this past maybe 6 months, I've really taken that opportunity to pause and kind of come to terms with, wow, what just happened to me? And am I happy with all the decisions I made while under that really pressurized kind of time? Yes, we're still in crisis, but for me, at least a little bit, it has slowed down. So I think that pause has allowed me to kind of reflect and maybe choose things differently.
Oh, that's great. And so now looking back on your work during the pandemic, and we're still, like you said, kind of in it, right? But during the height, what is one thing that you would have done differently, kind of looking back now?
Oh boy, differently. I don't know if I would have done, I appreciate the question, but I think, hindsight is always 20/20. So in any given situation, I could say, oh, well, maybe I would have done this, or maybe I would have thought about that. But I think I don't really have regrets in terms of the decisions that I made and what I chose to do in those moments. Do I wish that I maybe took a little bit more time in between graduating and starting my first job? Maybe that's one thing that I would change, is having a little bit more of a buffer time to really kind of enjoy that accomplishment before I needed to jump into the next thing.
Got it. That makes sense. So we'd love to kind of pivot and talk a little bit about your practice, right? So tell us more about, the work that you do, your practice, and the types of clients that you see.
Right now, I just joined a small group practice. We mostly serve communities of color who have experienced brain injury and are in the process of recovery. I am also a rehab-focused neuropsychologist. So in addition to doing the cognitive assessments, I also am involved with cognitive rehab, where I am providing neuropsychological intervention to restore functioning and to allow individuals to compensate for their weaknesses and in order to improve their quality of life.
Oh, nice. And I notice, you play a large role nationally in some of the work that you do. And so what are some of the statistics and evolution of, let's say, the psychosis diagnoses nationally that you've been noticing?
Oh, well, there has been some, research out there linking COVID itself to psychosis. There have been cases of individuals experiencing their first experience with psychosis after contracting COVID-19. There's also research coming out that has shown a link with individuals who've had psychosis having worsening symptoms after a period of stabilization. And it's unclear right now, just like many things are unclear with COVID and why, but some trends that we had seen were, individuals presenting with their first episode psychosis were significantly older than prior to the pandemic. And so there is more to come. We don't know exactly what the reasons are, if these are more related to kind of like the metabolic functions and the infection process, or if it was related to some of these other variables like loss of regular medical follow-up, loss of their support social networks. So, still a very needed area of research as we are in year 3 of the pandemic still.
Oh, definitely. And, tell us some more about, knowing this and seeing some of these trends because of the pandemic. How has this really impacted the delivery of culturally informed practices?
Yeah. I mean, psychology is just like any other institution. No institution is spared, right? And so even at the inception of psychology, psychiatry, unfortunately, there was a lot of embedded sexism, racism, ageism, ideas about what is normal, right? And one thing that I want to point out is within any kind of mental health diagnosis, we are within the definition describing a phenomenon that is culturally embedded, right? Because when we think of what the norm is and what a deviation from the norm is, culture is extremely important. And, at the start of the pandemic, nationally, globally, there's been a big cultural kind of reckoning of, how race has played out. And again, psychology is no different. We are noticing that, unfortunately, despite our best efforts, we're having a struggle to recruit and to retain diverse psychologists. And in that regard, unfortunately, we cannot meet the demand for individuals looking for therapists who may have a similar background or some kind of deeper understanding of, what they may be going through.
Yeah, and I noticed that you are one of the few bilingual practitioners in your field for Korean Americans, right? And so, no pressure, right? but talk about some of the ways in which you provide kind of this support, this national support for those in your community.
Yeah. Before I talk about the work that I've been doing, I want to put things into a little bit perspective. So the American Psychological Association is a national organization. It's the organization for psychologists. thankfully, they run their own statistics and surveys. And so they do surveys pretty regularly across the US. And for the past 10 years, they have studied how many doctoral degrees were awarded. And of that, it's not very reflective of the national data and the population. So within the past 10, so in a period of 2011 to 2022, there were 64,000 degrees that were given out. Of that, 1% of individuals identified as Indigenous, 6% identified as Asian, 9% identified as Black or African American, and 12% identified as Hispanic. So that means that the majority, over 70%, identified as white. Those numbers have not changed very much over the decade. And so for, many reasons, we are struggling to increase those numbers and increase representation. So because of that fact, because as much as I like to be a unicorn, I want more unicorns to frolic with. And so, I am part of many national organizations. One right now is the Asian Neuropsychological Association, where I serve as the current chair of the education committee. In that regard, our mission is to further promote or to even include individuals of Asian background to enhance, the further development professionally, as well as to make sure that even if, realistically, it's going to happen that an Asian patient will see a doctor who is not a cultural match. And so falling short of being able to provide them care in their preferred language or with a cultural match, we can at least inform the rest of the professional community on best practices, on the most culturally informed practices. So, we are giving out a lot of webinars on culturally inclusive practices. We're also educating professionals who are mentors and evaluators of students to make sure that they are also rating students appropriately and in a culturally inclusive way.
No, that's great. And I appreciate you mentioning that, because especially during a month like this, I think things like that are going to continue to be highlighted. So it's great that you kind of put that in perspective for us. Now something you mentioned earlier too was how you just kind of started with this new practice. And so recognizing that because this is kind of a blend, a little bit of why I left, a little mental health, right? But when you talk about transitioning roles, you dealt with some provider burnout, I understand. And so talk to us a little bit about how that manifested itself. You've mentioned it throughout. I'd love for you to expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I am sure that, my story is not a unique one, not only from, the friends and professional colleagues that I have, but I think in any industry, this happens quite often. And, as one of maybe a handful of psychologists of color on staff at the place that I was working at, which is a very large hospital, part of a broader system. We had staffed about maybe 150 to 200 psychologists. And within that, only, less than 10 were people of color. And so I felt an increasing kind of pressure to provide education to the rest of the department on culturally relevant topics to make sure that we were meeting the moment. Right? Students were coming in with even more knowledge than some of our faculty on, what was happening kind of during the cultural upheaval shifts that occurred early on in the pandemic, and then also wanting to have more equity-focused therapeutic work and training because they started to, as we're trying to diversify the workforce, you're going to have more diverse students coming in. And they were coming and uncomfortably teaching the faculty on things that they should have really known. And so, being one of very few people of color on staff, I felt like I needed to put myself out there. And so every committee that was started up, every task force, I joined. Pretty soon I was being asked to give presentations, every week, multiple ones, which as a early career psychologist, I felt like I needed to say yes to everything. These are opportunities. And then also, furthering the mission of, hopefully leading to more culturally inclusive psychological practices. Of course, initially I was very excited and just thrilled to have those opportunities. But, opportunity doesn't always come with extra time. So I had a full clinical caseload. And then on top of that, I was, doing a lot of additional work that not only was additional work and time, but emotional work. Sometimes I'd be in meetings with folks who, frankly, I just kind of felt a little bit like, if you don't get it, you don't want to get it. And I'm tired. After 2 years of trying to get people up to speed, it just started to wear on me. I was, coming into work and just starting to feel like, I don't know if this is being appreciated. There's a lot of lip service that was given, but it didn't seem to align with some of the other maybe negative backlash that I had been experiencing as well. And unfortunately, as we know, microaggressions, they're sometimes difficult to prove that they've occurred. And I just felt like I wasn't getting the kind of emotional support and safety. So that was my sign to maybe shift and focus more on why I got into the work, which is the people and the communities that I wanted to serve.
No, that's good. Good to hear that you made that that you recognize that, 2020, a lot of social justice initiatives were happening, right? Either folks in the BIPOC community, either clinicians, non-clinicians, asked to participate in some ways. And so you hear and read and see a lot of these types of incidences happen where it's just becomes so taxing because it's something that is like in addition to what you're already there paid to do anyway, right? And so I've had multiple conversations around that, and you'll kind of hear that throughout season 2. So question for you, right? Because when you think about burnout, and a lot of times people don't take the time to just like pause for a minute, right? But it sounds like you're kind of getting that pause now, or you've taken that pause now. So when you think about what's important to you right now and some of the things that you need right now, what does that look like?
It's community. It is, over the past few months since this transition, which is, a very busy time for me. I'm not making the same mistake by, burying myself in work. I am making sure that every weekend has some kind of family activity, that I am being in regular touch with my friends, that I am filling my cup up, because in the end, yes, I feel like this is a calling that I've had. I love the work that I do. I feel extremely grateful that I have this privilege to, help others in any little way. But I am also a person, and I also struggle, and I have, my own cup that needs to be filled. And I don't live to work. I work to live. So that is something that I'm remembering. Yes, I am motivated, and, I definitely have a lot of ambition, but maybe work isn't everything. Maybe there are other things that I could be spending my time on as well. And so I'm just trying to be, I don't like the phrase work-life balance, because often I just feel imbalance. I like the term work-life flow, because I feel like that captures the energy a little bit more. Sometimes I'm flowing a little bit more here, sometimes I'm flowing a little bit there. So
I like that. I like that a lot. Because I'm a proponent of not using balance either. I tend to use either like integration or harmony. But when I think about flow, I like that. The imagery of that just sits very well with me. Sorry, I'm like kind of thinking about that as currently.
I think about the famous saying from Bruce Lee, be like water. And I'm like, yes, I'm going to try to flow and be like water.
Yeah, that's a perfect analogy. That's a perfect analogy. So what I love that you have done, the intentionality around taking that time, right? spending time with family, doing these things on the weekend, obviously working to live, not living to work. But, there are, sadly, kind of a little bit of a pivot. There are some providers and people overall who are struggling with that, right? And one thing I noticed was that, psychologists who identify as, BIPOC have shown the most increased rate of suicide over the pandemic. In your field, obviously this is a very kind of somber topic, but something I feel like we have to get out there. In your field, you're noticing these things. What are some of the conversations that are being had with this community within the mental health space? Because those numbers, the fact that this is happening is sad.
Yeah, it is very sad. What we noticed, well, first, the conversations are happening, right? This is not something that was talked about before. People assume that just because you work in mental health, that your mental health is, stellar and that you have no issues. But everybody knows doctors make the worst patients. And so we have our own blind spots too, right? Because is such a small group of mental health providers of color, a lot of times in these larger institutions, they are tasked with the kind of additional cultural tax of educating their peers, which can be incredibly emotionally draining. You're sitting here in a group of individuals who you think respect you and understand you and want you there. And sometimes from these trainings, you kind of leave more demoralized, just almost in awe at seeing where people are and they're not up to speed in some of these really important areas. And so you start to develop a little bit of imposter syndrome. So do I not belong here? Do they not want me here? And, it makes me think of a quote from a CRT scholar, professor and department chair, Dafina Lazarus-Stewart at Colorado State University. She puts it, they put it very well. Diversity asks, how many more of whatever minoritized identity group do we have this year than last? Equity responds, what conditions have we created that maintain certain groups as the perpetual majority here? Inclusion asks, is this environment safe for everyone to feel like they belong? Justice challenges, whose safety is being sacrificed and minimized to allow others to be comfortable maintaining dehumanizing views? And so as psychologists of color have been tasked with educating their peers and sometimes whole departments and institutions on equity and the continuous work that needs to be done, it's hard to also at the same time conceal just how exhausted you are. And that shows. And sometimes, and this is something that I'm speaking from personally too, you have people who are well-intentioned and they're like, yeah, we love the message, but man, you just look so miserable in that presentation. Or, it seems like you're really stressed out. And it's like, okay, thanks for noticing, but maybe it's time for you to pick up where I left off. I tell my white colleagues this all the time. Racism is not a people of color issue. This is a white issue. So if you're going to fix it, we need y'all to lead these talks and yes, consult with us and other people of color to make sure that you're on the right page. But, it's your turn now.
Right. No, that makes sense. And a lot of a piece of the show that I always like to get to is really around this advice for others. Right. And so obviously, we've talked about a lot during this discussion. And when I think about providers and clinicians specifically, right? So what can they do to ensure they're taking care of themselves?
Yeah. So it's like, I love this question, but I also hate this question because I know that self-care is like such a trigger term for a lot of folks and for me too, because, it places the onus on the individual. Like if you're suffering, that means you're not doing enough, which is like the problem itself. But I also understand that, yes, you have to, I want to enable people to feel like they have control and that there are areas that they can improve. But I needed to add that caveat.
No, I appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really just, again, I mean, I'm going back to my own journey, but taking that moment to pause and reflect and to remember why it is you started doing this work. Nobody goes into psychology because it's glamorous. People, even though I'm like on this podcast and I'm very excited to have this opportunity to further the message, for most of us, for most of my day, I'm just in my office. It's a very unglamorous kind of job that I do. It's remembering what the purpose was, what were the values that led you there, and returning back to that values kind of led life. And within that, it is, psychologists obviously are interested in people. That most of them are people person. Um, and so it's also, again, getting back into the community, finding your people. I had so many colleagues that I just like couldn't have done anything without. So I was incredibly grateful to have had a collective of women of color who are practicing psychology and psychiatry. And we would meet every week, over meal. Yes, there were some, complaining about this and that, but most of it was us supporting one another and being like, no, you are doing excellent work. And, you're not wrong for calling things out. And what you are noticing did happen the way that you're recalling them. And so that kind of support is not something that, again, no, you can't go at it alone. You need that, those people to help you through it. So I would say self-care is by caring for others and then getting that care back in return.
I like that. And now more broadly, right, I think going back to some of the core of your work as well, when can a neuropsychological evaluation be helpful for someone?
Yeah, it really depends. So I'm a lifespan neuropsychologist. What that means is that I do evaluations, for young kiddos, school age kiddos, through adulthood and then older adults. But in general, a neuropsychological evaluation can be helpful if you or others are noticing changes in your thinking skills and your behavior, or you are diagnosed with neurodiversity and want to learn more about your individual strengths and weaknesses profile, individuals living with chronic illness and seeking accommodation for work or school. These are folks that could benefit from a neuropsychological evaluation.
Very nice. And now during, Mental Health Awareness Month, BIPOC Mental Health Month, how do we get more diverse groups of people in the field and more involved?
So actually, some newer research has been coming out by neuropsychologists of color in the field. One article that comes to mind is an article by Michelle Mador and Desiree Bird. And it was a recent kind of survey that they had done to meet that question of how do we get more people, how do we increase representation in the field? And by and large, when they surveyed neuropsychologists of color, the main thing that they found was mentorship was really, really important. And quality mentorship. I myself, my first supervisor of color, we're still friends. And now we work together in the Asian Neuropsychological Association. That kind of relationship. One, I saw myself reflected. It was another Asian woman. I was like, wow, okay, I see that she's doing that. And that made me believe that I could do it myself. And, having mentorship to, again, fill them in. A lot of our trainees of color, they are often the first people in their families to attend college and then get post-secondary education, to enter a workforce. And so there's a lot of unspoken social norms that unfortunately, sometimes we don't know. And we have to be kind of cautious about as well. And so getting that kind of real mentorship of what to expect and what not to take too. Oh, that's so important. Coming up training in a academic setting, there's a lot that you just a lot of negative things that you just take on because you're like, oh, I'm just have to pay my dues and kind of take this exploitation and just kind of roll with it. But having good mentors helped me advocate for what was right and what I needed in my training. And when things were unethical or inappropriate, they counseled me in the right direction to really stick up for myself.
I appreciate you mentioning that. All right. Well, look, Chrissy, I just want to say thank you for taking some time to speak with me today. I enjoyed obviously learning about you and your practice, the clients you serve, and just all the things that you're doing in the community and beyond. I would love for us to stay in touch, but also would love for you to share where our listeners can find you and support you.
People can find me on LinkedIn as well as our group practice website. If you Google Chrissy J. Lee, PhD, you'll be able to find me. I have it in my to-do list for 2023 to start up a website. So maybe by the time this drops, that will be up and running.
Very nice. All right. So look, that'll do it for today's episode. Again, I want to thank Dr. Chrissy Lee for joining us today. I'll share her information in our show notes, and I hope you all have a great week, and we'll definitely see you next time. Thanks again, Dr. Lee.
My pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks again for listening to Why I Left. Be sure to join us next time for more stories from the Great Resignation. Visit us at www.whyileft.co. That's whyileft.co. And subscribe to the show on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.